So, you've just been given a second-hand Nitro Car, or you bought yourself a Nitro Car on eBay, or even been given a brand new one. And you're thinking, what do I need to do to get this thing to start? And how do I run it correctly? So this video really is designed to help you in easy sections understand exactly what to do. We're going to be doing this in several sections, so you can skip to the relevant section if you wish, and the section titles are on the bottom of your screen on the timeline. But we're going to cover things like the nitro starter, the glow plugs, the different fuel types, and the radio gear and how to set it all up. So let's take a look over the car. This particular car is a brand new HSP buggy, but the same principles apply to whether it's a buggy, a car or a truck. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the lid off and we'll have a look underneath the body shell and look at the various components of the car. And you can see here, here's the engine. In the engine is the glow plug which sits in the head. You've got the air filter, carburettor. In here sits the radio gear. There's two servos, one here and one on the side here. One does the steering and the other one does the throttle and the brake together. This particular car has a 2-speed gearbox, which you can see by looking underneath by the 2 spur gears, which means at a certain rev range it'll kick into a second gear. You can determine if your car's got single speed or 2-speed by the amount of gears in the central gearbox here. It also has a standard fuel tank, standard exhaust, and of course no need to tell you that the exhaust will get hot when the engine's running, so try not to touch it if you can. The shock absorbers front and back, sometimes they're different sizes, in this case they're the same, and obviously your wheels and tyres. One thing to do is always make sure that the tyres are glued on. You'll be surprised how quickly a tyre can come off if you race around the corner and it's not being glued on properly. Incidentally, most new tyres are supplied unglued, so you might want to be aware of that. So that's a quick look over the car. Now let's have a look at the radio gear. You need at least a 2-channel radio set when you set the car up. 2 channels, one for the steering and one for the brake and throttle. The brake and throttle are operated by the same servo and therefore work together. What I'm going to do for the purposes of demonstration is I'm going to turn the car on and I'm going to turn the controller on, and then when I demonstrate you'll see exactly what happens. So the first thing we're going to look at is the steering. The steering is controlled by this wheel here, and simply turn right or turn left. This is a pistol grip style controller. Some are the old-fashioned stick style controllers, but most modern ones now, the 2.4 GHz, run on the pistol grip version. In addition, you've got, I'll just lift the car up there slightly. In addition, you've got the throttle, which is here, and the brake, which is this one here. If you push it forward, there's the brake, and pull it backwards, there's your throttle. We'll talk about the adjustments of those later on. Now some controllers actually have a 3rd channel, and the 3rd channel will always appear in the form of a switch. In this case the switch is just here. Nothing will happen on this car because there's no 3rd channel attached, but you can use this for example for putting LED lights on, or if your car is lucky enough to have a reverse gear that's operated by a servo, you can do it via the switch. And that's, in a nutshell, that's the basic controller. Having said that, there's a couple of other options you need to be aware of. All controllers come with a number of switches and a number of trims. First of all, the switches operate in normal or reverse mode, and that all depends on the car you've got. So for example, the channels will be channel 1 does the steering, and that's on every model. Channel 2 does the brake and throttle, and that's on every model. And channel 3 will be your auxiliary channel, i.e. the reverse or the LEDs. But if we look at channel 1 for example, if I switch the switch for channel 1, and you'll see now that when I turn the steering to the right, it actually turns the car to the left. So what I've done now is I've changed it from normal to reverse. This is entirely dependent on your car, and you may find you have to set it in the right direction to make it turn the way you want it to go. The same works in the throttle. The throttle also has a reverse direction switch, so if I flick the reverse direction switch, when I squeeze the throttle, it'll actually put the brake on, and when I push forward, it'll make the car go forward. That's entirely preference of the way you want it, but again you have the option of changing that, and that will appear on pretty much most controllers. Now in addition you have a number of trims, and the trims allow you to set the controller up so that it works correctly with the car. So for example the steering trim, if I turn the steering trim, let me just find the steering trim here, just to find which one we're looking at, channel 1, this one here. If I turn the steering trim, you can see that as I turn the steering trim, so the wheels turn slightly. Okay, so that allows you to put the car in a straight line. If you run it on idle and run it in a straight line down a path, then you can play with the steering trim until it goes straight, and then you know that wherever you are on the controller, when you let go, it will always return to a straight line. I use the same trim, the same style of trim for the throttle, so I can play with the throttle or brake, and you can see that happening on the car there. So what I use this for is I normally set it to a mid position, which is where it's in neutral. That means the car's sitting on tick over. And then I can actually use the trim to open the throttle slightly for starting, because often when you start the car you need the throttle slightly more open than an idle. So we turn the trim to start the car, we can then start the car normally, and then we turn the trim back again so that it goes to idle. And that's just a clever way of using the trims on the controller. Okay, so that in a nutshell is the radio gear. There's lots of other things I can tell you about binding, etc., but we'll cover those in another video later on. One final thing to be aware of is that some receivers have a built-in fail-safe, or indeed you can usually buy a fail-safe as a second device. And what that means is if the handset should lose communication with the car at any time, because these are fast little cars, it automatically closes the throttle and puts the brakes on. And you can see this happening here, for example. If I turn the controller off before I turn the car off, you'll see the car immediately shuts the throttle and puts the brakes on. So that car will just come to a direct stop. That's a very useful feature to have when you're looking at buying controllers or radio gear. So let's have a look at what we need to make this car run. First of all, we're going to put the radio gear out of the way because we no longer need that. And we'll come back and we'll start looking at the car itself. So we're going to need a nitro starter, which is what we put on top of the glow plug, and this makes the plug glow. I'll go through that in a bit more detail in just a moment. We're also going to need a small toolkit, and you can see here, for example, this one is the plug spanner. That's very important. And you've got various wheel spanners and other spanners for various parts of the car too. And then you've got a Phillips and a flat blade screwdriver, also very useful when you're making tweaks or turns to the carburetor, etc. We're going to need some nitro fuel. In this case, this is a 20% mix of fuel. I'll cover the nitro fuel in a separate section on the different mixes, but that's one thing to note is you're going to need new fuel. Never use old fuel because you don't know where it's been or how long it's been stored for or even what condition it's been stored. And the nitromethane, the nitro part of it, can evaporate and absorb moisture, which means that you'll have trouble running the engine. So always use new fuel. You're also going to need a fuel bottle to fill the tank. It's very difficult to fill a small tank from a bottle such as this, so by using a fuel bottle it makes it much easier. So you fill the fuel bottle and then you can use the fuel bottle to fill the tank. That also makes it much easier if you want to refuel while the car is still running and carry on driving without having to stop it first. And then lastly, we also need a glow starter charger, which is what's used to charge the battery in our glow starter in order to start the plug. So let's move the fuel out of the way for the time being and the bottle out of the way for the time being. And what I'm going to do is just very quickly show you how a glow plug glows. So to start any engine we need for three things to happen. First of all, we need to make sure that fuel gets through to the carburetor. Secondly, we need to make sure that we've got compression. And lastly, we need to make sure that the glow plug is glowing. And that's what we're going to check right now. So I've got one here. This is one that has come out of a different engine. It's a brand new glow plug, and I'm going to show you how it should look when the glow plug is inserted into the starter. And normally this is in the engine so you don't see this, but that's what we're looking for, that type of glow on a glow plug. Okay, anything orange or dull red will do, but if it's black it means that the glow plug is either blown or your glow starter is not charged. So let's take that out, and that's what we're looking for. So in order to start this engine correctly, the glow plug starter needs to be inserted by depressing the spring, such as that, and then clipped over the plug. And you can see once it's on, it holds itself on quite well, so you know that it's on correctly. And that plug is now glowing inside the engine. So from here, we can then make sure that fuel is going through, pull the starter, and away we go. So let's talk about fuel. We're going to move this stuff to one side, and we're going to bring in our bottle of fuel. There we are. This particular fuel is a 20% mix, and I'll explain exactly what that means. First of all, there are two basic different types of fuel that you can buy. One is castor oil based, and one is a synthetic oil based fuel. I always use a synthetic oil based fuel because it burns cleaner, has a nicer smell as well, and doesn't make a mess of your car. The castor oil based ones tend to be yellow in colour, whereas the synthetic ones are usually pink, such as this. There are lots of components that make up the fuels, but to give you an idea, the 20% is the amount of nitromethane in the fuel. So for example, this is 20%, and it means that there's 20% nitromethane and 80% lubricant. And these are primitive two-stroke engines, and they require a lot of lubricant to run. So what I would suggest is when you're starting out or running in a new engine, 20 or 15 is a good fuel to start with, and then once it's been run in and you want to race it a little bit, go from 20 to 25. I would personally never go anywhere near 30, because 30 is what the racing boys use, and they can expect to get through an engine and race, and that's an expensive hobby when you do it that way. You can go down to 5 or 10% nitro if you want to, and if you've got a particularly tough or high compression engine to run in, then that's a good place to start, because that'll have plenty of lubricant. But it won't give you much power, and it's certainly worth, once you can, moving up to a higher percentage if you can. So 20 or 25 is what I suggest. And you buy these in 1 litre or 2.27 litre bottles. So moving the fuel out of the way for the time being, we're assuming that the fuel tank is now full of fuel, and the way to fill it is obviously with our fuel filler bottle. What we need to do to get the car started is we need to prime the carburettor. Now the correct way of priming the carburettor is to put a finger over the exhaust and then pull on the starter a few times without, there we are, like that, without any glow plug on the glow plug itself, any glow plug starter on the glow plug itself. Okay, and that you should see fuel start to drift along the fuel pipe and into the engine. And when it gets to the engine, then you know you've primed the carburettor. There are other ways of doing it. Another way of doing it is just to remove the air filter, and again using the fuel filler bottle, just dribble a little bit of fuel into the carburettor. You really don't want to put too much in there. If you put too much in there, you have the possibility of flooding the engine. If the engine's flooded, you will find it very, very hard to turn over when you try and pull the pull start. It'll be very, very difficult to pull. And in addition, it's very common that if you try to start a flooded engine, it'll blow the glow plug. The pressure of the fuel around the coil in the plug will cause it to blow, and it's dead. After that, you can take it out and throw it away, because it will not glow anymore. Okay. One other thing to mention is that the air filter itself usually comes, when you buy them new, they usually come without any oil on. You can buy special air filter oil, and just put a dab of oil on the top there, and the only reason you're doing that is to stop the dust going straight through the foam and into the engine. You can use air filter oil, as I say, or alternatively you can use any other oil, as long as it's not too thick and just does the job of stopping the dust. That's all it really needs to be. You also need to squeeze it out afterwards to make sure it's not dripping wet, because if it's too clogged, it won't allow the fuel through. If you've got a second-hand car, the chances are that the air filter has already perished, and you can tell that. If the foam looks perished or dirty or tired, then really replace the air filter. Never be tempted to run the car without an air filter, simply because if you run it in dirt or dust, it will wreck the engine, and I can guarantee it'll wreck the engine in a matter of seconds if a dirt or dust gets in there from a dusty track, for example. So never be tempted to run it without an air filter. Always make sure that there's one in place. So we're going to do some final checks before we actually start this car and run it. Okay, taking a look at the car again, and this time we're going to use the controller to make sure that we do our final checks correctly. So I'm going to turn the controller on and the car on, and there we are. I heard the car kick in. So one of the checks we're going to do is to make sure that the steering works correctly and turns from left and right. If it's slightly crooked or we can't set the trim correctly, then I would take the horn off the servo from there, and you'll see it's on a splined mechanism, so you can actually just move the horn left or right to get the steering to be correct. That's the first check I would make. Once the steering's done, then we move on to the brake and throttle. Now I'm going to take the air filter off to show you how this is done, so that you can see. So let's just remove the air filter for now. And if you look inside the carburettor, you can see the shiny barrel inside the carburettor. So the check that we need to make sure of is that when the throttle is pulled open, the barrel opens correctly, and when it's closed, it comes to a rest, and there has a very, very slight hole at the back. Sometimes it's so small that you can't see it, and it might be difficult to see it on the film. And then also, when we squeeze the throttle the other way, the brake actuates, and you can see here the spring tension is taken up the throttle won't close anymore because it's already closed, and the brake is pulled on the central gearbox. So there's our checks, and again we can just make doubly sure by rolling the car along the ground and applying the brake, and as long as it locks the wheels up in that manner, then we know that the brakes are good. Brakes are probably more important than the throttle at this point in time. Okay, so there's our final checks. Now we can get ready to start the car. So nitro engines don't have a choke in the way that modern engines do in your family car, for example. So what we need to do is we need to open the carburettor slightly to allow a little bit of fuel in. And if I move the trim on the controller, and you'll see that happen in just a moment, but right now, watch the barrel in the carburettor and you'll see it open slightly. There we are. And you see we're going to leave it open, and that's now in starting mode. That means that when it starts, it'll race quite fast, and then once it's started, we can then bring the trim down and it closes the throttle again. I'll just show you very quickly on the controller where that happens, and I'll put it close to the carburettor so you can see. There we are. So we're going to open it right up so that there's a slight gap in the barrel, so it runs fast. Okay, that done, I now need to prime the engine, and the way I prime the engine, as I said before, is finger over the exhaust, and we do a few pulls on the engine. And then there's one last step we need to do to get the engine to start. Before I do that, I just want to explain one very important feature, and that is the pull start. The pull start is not an infinite length. As you can see from this one, that's as far as it comes out. It's very, very common to over pull the pull start. So that's what we're looking at. And the trick to starting a car is short, sharp pulls. So if you did it may not start. So what you're looking for is short, sharp pulls, and that would be like this. And you can see I'm not going anywhere near the full length of the pull start. So that's all I want to explain about that. In order to start this car now, what we would do is we'll put our glow plug on. We make sure that it's clipped onto the plug. There we are. The plug is glowing. We know we've got fuel in the carburettor, and from here what I would do is, and that will now start the car. Once the car is running, then we turn the trim down so it goes back onto idle, and you're ready to run. Give it just a few seconds for the plug to warm up. It doesn't take very long. Remove the starter, and when you remove the starter, the car should stay running quite happily. From that point, you can put the body on and you're ready to go. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate your time. If you'd like to see any other self-help videos, I have a whole selection of videos that can help you to do things such as replace the clutch, rewind the pull start, glue tyres on, etc. They're all to be found in the help and advice section on rcscrapyard.com. Thank you very much for watching.